Assalamu alaikum, this is Emad Hamdeh. I wanted to share with you some information about my article with Yaqeen Institute about the importance and necessity of hadith in Islam. The reason I chose to write on this topic was because there's a growing trend within the Muslim community that rejects the hadith in total, and they say only follow the Qur'an. This rejection of all ahâdith and following only the Qur'an often stems from a good place. People want to follow the purest version of the religion. They may find certain texts or certain ahâdith that are problematic, and they don't want to follow that. So they find the easiest way is just to follow the Qur'an. The safest way is to follow the Qur'an by itself. This trend of rejecting hadith is a particularly modern phenomenon. And one of the arguments I kind of make is that it's due to a rise of access of information, among other reasons. So people have access now, or they're exposed to texts and ahadith that they would not have been exposed to previously without the explanation of a scholar. So if we go back several hundred years, if someone wanted to learn or read a hadith, they would usually have to go to the masjid, to the mosque, sit with a scholar and listen to him read the hadith and explain the meaning that comes along with it. Now, many times people experience a hadith, or they're exposed to a hadith in translation online and completely stripped of any kind of interpretation and contextualization. So this often leads them to be frustrated with hadith or that particular hadith. And this may happen to them several times, and it leads them to the conclusion that hadith are unreliable, and therefore they reject them completely. So in my article, I try to look at two things. The first is, what does the Qur'an itself say about following the Sunnah and following the Prophet? Is it possible, does the Qur'an command Muslims to follow only the Qur'an? So when we look at what does the Qur'an say about the authority of the Prophet, the Qur'an makes it very clear that the Prophet is a legislator. So for instance, there is the call to prayer, the adhan, which is mentioned in the Qur'an as an action, but there's no commandment to make that call to prayer. So for instance, the Qur'an will say, when it's called to the prayer on Friday, leave off buying and selling and rush to the remembrance of God. However, there's no command in the Qur'an that says make the call to prayer. So where did that call to prayer come from? Who initiated it? It must have been the Prophet himself. And I give several other examples like this in the article. Furthermore, there is the chronology of certain verses in the Qur'an that can only be understood properly with the Sunnah. So for instance, there are certain verses that say that you should not approach prayer while you are drunk. There are other verses that say stay away from intoxication completely. And there are other verses that say that intoxication has some good in it and some bad. How do you contextualize these? Which ones came first? Was it prohibited first and then made permissible? Or was it permissible and then made prohibited? Without the context of the Sunnah, you would not be able to know which one came first. The second point I make is that the Qur'an cannot be understood without extra Quranic sources. What I mean by that is if we strip the Qur'an of all understandings besides the Qur'an loses meaning. So the Qur'an, for an example, it'll mention places, it'll mention people, it'll mention events, and the Qur'an presupposes that the reader knows these things. So for instance, the Qur'an mentions one companion by name, the companion Zayd. The Qur'an presupposes that the reader knows who Zayd is, so that the implications of the Prophet's marriage to Zayd's wife are understood legally. The Qur'an would mention Badr, it would mention Uhud, it would mention other events, and it again presupposes that the reader knows these things. If you don't know these things, so if you say I'm going to approach the Qur'an, I'm going to remove the entire influence of the Sunnah on my memory, on my understanding, and you approach it simply as that, you will not know when it was revealed, you will not know the context of certain events and places, and these verses lose their meaning. So in that regard, I kind of argue that the Qur'an relies on the reader knowing this context of in which it was revealed. And that means that in order for the Qur'an to be authentic or properly understood, it relies on this outside source. Therefore, the outside source must also be preserved, because if that outside source is incorrectly preserving things about the meaning of the Qur'an, the meaning of the Qur'an itself is lost. So I hope you read the article and benefit from it, and I hope you like it. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.